Good morning. Today I have with me Professor Peter Saunders, Emeritus Professor at the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW. Peter is one of Australia's foremost experts on poverty, inequality and deprivation. He's done a mountain of work, not only in those areas, but also in social policy more broadly. He was the director of the Social Policy Research Centre for 20 years. And is still actively researching these topics in Australia. So, Peter, thank you very much for joining us for this class on economic inequality at UTS. Um, uh, and I'll start off by asking you a question about what piqued your own interest to study poverty and deprivation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I started off in economics. My first degree and my master's degree, both in the UK, were in economics. I did quite well at that, and it was in the quantitative end of economics. And I was offered a two-year position at my university of Southampton. And during that time, I became conscious of the fact that I didn't really fit in an economics department. And I felt that the kinds of things I was interested in and the way I thought about addressing topics was different to many of my colleagues. So that was the first beginnings of what led to where I am today. My first tenured lectureship was at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And a condition of that appointment was that I teach part of the undergraduate course in public economics. I was given the taxation side to talk about over a term and a half. I think it was a third year undergraduate course. And during the course of teaching that, I was one of those early career lecturers who was sort of 1 week ahead of their students in terms of their knowledge of the topic. I hadn't studied taxation myself as a student. But I came across work on what was called a tax credit scheme, and this was being proposed at that time. This is the early 1970s in England as a new way of providing social benefits through the tax system, a form of what's now called negative income tax. And I read a very interesting monograph that was quite critical of the government's proposals, written by a very famous economist, Tony Atkinson. And that really sparked my interest in social security systems and how one can design systems to alleviate poverty. But that led me into to read another book by Tony Atkinson called Poverty in Britain and the Reform of Social Security. And that really it was an exciting read. Very challenging. It made me realize how challenging it was to study a topic like poverty. And one had to understand not only the kind of economics underlying the concept, which we'll get to, but also how the social security system works in great detail, because until you had that understanding, you couldn't really analyze what any new system, any reforms would do to people's incomes and their standards of living. So I moved then in the mid-70s to Australia to a position at the University of Sydney, where I was again asked, interestingly enough, to teach public finance, this side, the expenditure side, not the tax side. But I came to Australia in August 1975, had very few possessions. I was relatively young then. And the few possessions I had were mainly books, which I sent ahead of my trip here in a series of tea chests. I arrived at Sydney in August, and of course hadn't taken into account the fact that the academic year in Australia was different to the one in the UK. And whereas I just finished an academic year in the UK, I arrived in Australia just before the third term was beginning. And it turned out that no one at Sydney was expecting me until the following February when the new term began. So they had no teaching for me. And they basically said, well, you may as well go away for 6 months and do some research, which was fantastic, not the sort of thing I don't think you'd be offered these days in university. But the problem for me was that I didn't have any books. All my books didn't arrive in Australia ahead of me as I was promised. And so I had all this time on my hands, but no books to use to study research. And I went downtown in Sydney looking around and found what was in those days called the Government Bookshop, which was in Pitt Street. And it was a bookshop where you could buy government reports, everything from the budget papers to government reports on this, that, and the other, all kinds of topics. And the window was totally overtaken by a glorious display of a book that had been released, a report that had been released that week called Poverty in Australia. And I went inside and I looked through this and discovered to my surprise that the major policy recommendation of that report was a form of negative income tax, what they called a guaranteed minimum income scheme, or what we would today probably call a basic income scheme, was proposed. So I bought the report and I went home and read it and found it very interesting. And of course, most of that report is about poverty, how to measure poverty and what poverty looked like in Australia, what the social security system at the time looked like and so on, and why the author of the report, the main head of the commission, Poverty Commission, Professor Ronald Henderson from the University of Melbourne, why he ended up thinking that a guaranteed minimum income scheme was the way to go. I wasn't quite so convinced. I was a bit more sceptical because I'd read Tony Atkinson's work in the UK, and I wrote an article trying to explain why I thought the UK experience might be relevant to Australia and why it might be better to try and work on a reform using the current social security system and addressing its weaknesses rather than a radical, what was considered would have been a very radical reform, which was the guaranteed income. And that paper was published in the Australian Journal of Social Issues the following year. So 1 year after I arrived in Australia, I had a paper published on the Henderson report. And following that paper, I met Ronald Henderson and he and I became very good friends and I saw him very often and he introduced me to all of the main players studying poverty research in Australia and to people in the federal government who were responsible for the social security system. So within a year of coming to this strange country, I was an expert in this field. Rather surprising, but I was happy to do that because I found the work very interesting, and Henderson got me invited to all kinds of conferences and seminars and so on. And so it started, and over time, my interest moved from a focus on social security and the income support system to a focus on poverty and how we might conceive and measure it.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's fascinating. The coincidence of having arrived just as that report was released. As you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about Ron Henderson and the Henderson Poverty Inquiry. So let's go to that question next. Poverty research in Australia arguably started in the 1960s and was led by Ronald Henderson of the Melbourne Institute, and that culminated in the Henderson Poverty Inquiry and the Henderson Poverty Line, which has had really lasting impact in Australia. Very significant time in Australia, generally in terms of social change, but also the huge amount of prominence and focus on this particular line of work. So my first question on that is what do you think it was about society, Australian society, that led to this flurry of interest and impact of poverty research?
Yeah, well, of course, the view at the time, and it's still quite a strong view in Australia, is this is the land of the fair go, and people basically are treated decently and equally, and if that was the case, then we ought to be a country where poverty was very low or non-existent. And Henderson, when he first came, he also, by the way, was a Pom like me. He came from the University of Cambridge to take up the chair in Melbourne. And he was telling me that one of the first things he asked when he came was about poverty research in Australia. He was head of the institute in Melbourne, which was called the Institute of applied economic and social research. He was an economist, but he was very keen to develop the social side of the Institute's work. And he was told that there'd been no study of poverty in Australia. And so he set about doing a study of poverty in Melbourne. The researchers actually conducted a survey in 1966 of the households in Melbourne, which collected a lot of information about their circumstances, including their incomes and so on. And he set a poverty line. I'll get to the details of that in a minute. But basically, the report showed that far from there being no poverty in Australia, or at least in Melbourne, the poverty rate he estimated was, I think, about 10%, which was, about the kind of, certainly wasn't the lowest that existed in OECD countries, and certainly wasn't the highest, but it was higher, I think, than most people in Australia expected. And at that time, of course, this was 60s, late 60s. Australia was a booming economy and had been so for a very long time. Unemployment was almost non-existent. I mean, it very rarely went above 2%, the unemployment rate, through the 50s and 60s and 70s. But there were some serious problems looming. The oil crisis hit all Western economies in 1973, when the Arab nations basically stopped the supply, or threatened to stop the supply of oil. Prices went through the roof and inflation took off. And suddenly Australia found itself, far from being a kind of 3 or 4% growth every year, let's keep it going country, was facing inflation heading up towards 20%, and an unemployment rate that was also going far beyond what had been expected. So poverty in that context now became more of a concern, because if we weren't doing that well when things were going great economically, what on earth was going to happen when these economic disasters that were on the horizon came about? So the Henderson report got, the first initial report on Melbourne got a tremendous amount of publicity and set the politicians worried. And that was the reason why the government at the time set up the Poverty Commission and appointed Henderson to chair it.
And let's come back to that Henderson poverty line in a moment. I wanted to ask you sort of more broadly that poverty is of course quite an emotive term, and can be conceptualized in different ways. It's no surprise that given your interest in poverty, you ended up the director of a multidisciplinary research centre which looked at related issues through all sorts of lenses. What do you think is the best way to conceptualize and study poverty, and have your views evolved on this over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the definition here is very important. And given the nature of the topic, as you say, it is an emotive topic. People tend to have strong views on this either way. It's all a fiction, don't believe them, to Australia's in a terrible mess, we've got to do something about this. So getting the definition right is very, very important. And many people have had a go at this, and many of the definitions I find rather unhelpful. So I'm going to give you a definition which I think is a good definition, and then we can discuss why I think it's a good definition and why some others are not so good. And this was proposed by what's called the Combat Poverty Agency in Ireland, actually, I think in the 1980s. And they define poverty as follows: people are living in poverty if their incomes are so inadequate as to preclude them from having an acceptable standard of living. Incomes are so inadequate as to preclude people from having an adequate standard of living. Now, there's no, it's a very simple definition. There are two key variables, if you like, in that definition. One, and they're both economic, that's very important. One is income, and the other one is standard of living. So incomes being adequate implies standards of living are acceptable. And that definition has led to two basically streams, the two main streams of poverty research, which are focused around two key questions. Question one, are incomes adequate? Question two, are living standards acceptable? And the first approach was the one that people will be most familiar with. And this involves looking at people's income and comparing it with a poverty line, which is what Henderson did. And that's the way most, certainly most economists nowadays would still measure poverty, by looking at people's income and seeing whether or not it is above a poverty line. But the second approach, which we'll get to, doesn't look at income, looks at the result of not having an adequate income, which is a standard of living which is unacceptable. Now, of course, that raises questions: unacceptable by who? What does unacceptable mean? And we can get onto that. But I think the key thing is to keep the definition simple. Poverty is basically an economic situation where the resources that people have, the economic resources available to people, are not adequate enough for them to be fully participating, if you like, in the society in which they live. Many of the other definitions try and include in the definition some of the things they think are either causing poverty or resulting from poverty. So you'll see definitions that begin like as people are poor if they lack the education that is needed. No, stop there. Stop there, please. Definition no good. You're already starting to presume something about what's causing poverty, lack of education. Now, it's true that many people who don't get an adequate education end up poor, but not everyone with a low education is poor, but not everyone who's poor has had a low education. So if you make that your definition, you are going to bias the way you think about the problem. You could also say the same thing about health. People are poor because they suffer from health problems and blah blah blah. Again, sorry, no, not health. We can look at the relationship between poverty and health. That's a very important topic, but don't define poverty itself as being a necessary consequence of health, ill health. Poverty is about lacking economic resources. Stop, full stop. That will do for a definition.
Thanks, Peter. So now, given that there are many ways that poverty is measured, moving on from the definition and going on to the measurement, and most often that tends to be through a existence or the definition of some sort of poverty line. And if somebody is below the poverty line, then they're treated as or counted as being in poverty, and if they're above, they're treated as not being in poverty. I was just going to get you to reflect on that and share some thoughts on that, starting with what the famous Henderson poverty line, how that was defined, how that was operationalized, and also how that relates to other poverty lines that have been used and still are used today.
Yeah. Well, when Henderson did his report, the initial report on poverty in Melbourne, of course, there was no poverty line in Australia for him to draw on. So he basically had to come up with his own. And basically, he was also aware that it was very helpful to make a poverty line consistent or congruent with the society that you're trying to measure poverty in. And a key feature of Australia, from Henderson's point of view at the time, and it still is a key feature, I think, although we often forget it, is that we use the wage system to set a floor on people's incomes. What in Henderson's time was called the basic wage, now called the minimum wage, is set independent of government by what's now called the Fair Work Commission on a regular basis. And governments can put in submissions about what they think should happen, but the final call is outside of their hands. And that's a very important part of the Australian system. So Henderson's starting point was the basic wage. So he took a family, a husband, a wife, and 2 children, and said, I'll set the poverty line for this family equal to the basic wage that one of the parents, obviously normally in those days it would be the husband, working full time would receive through the basic wage. But of course, there was some other income that all families in that situation would receive. And that was, it was in those days called child endowment. We now call it, it's changed its name later to family allowance and is now called family tax benefit, I think, because it's partly paid through the tax system. But in those days, mothers would receive a child endowment for each of their children. So the Henderson poverty line in 1966 was the basic wage, which would be income going to the husband, plus the child endowment for 2 children, which would be the income going to the wife. And that amount was the startling figure in 1966, believe it or not, of $33 a week. Now, one of the problems with using that to measure poverty is that it can produce rather perverse results. Because imagine a government comes to office saying that we're a new government and we're going to address poverty in this country once and for all. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to provide a massive increase in child endowment. And we're going to argue that there should be a big increase in the basic wage as well. What would happen? Basic wage goes up, child endowment goes up, and the poverty line goes up, and almost certainly the poverty rate will go up. So the problem with using for your poverty line a figure that reflects government policy is you can't use the poverty line to assess government policy. In fact, it can produce the strange results if you do. So when the Poverty Commission set its poverty line, this was now some 6 or 7 years later in the early 70s, what Henderson did was said, well, what I need a measure that is independent of these variables, the basic wage and child endowment, but I want it to be relatable to my earlier measure. So what he did was he worked out what percentage of average earnings the earlier figure was, and it turned out to be about 56% of average earnings. So he said, I'm going to set the new poverty line in the 1970s at 56% of average weekly earnings. And over time, as the economy grows, average weekly earnings will increase and the poverty line will increase, but it will be tied to that measure of average earnings. And that's important because of Australia's reliance on labour income as a primary form of income and a primary way of addressing poverty. So he moved from a government sort of, if you like, official definition based on basic wage to one which was more a labour market definition based on earnings as the poverty line. And all of the estimates you'd find in the Henderson report are based on that poverty line, that revised poverty line.
And how does that relate to other poverty lines that are being used to this day?
Well, as I say, at that time, even in the 70s, very few countries were actually producing estimates of poverty. So there wasn't much to compare it with then. However, one of the problems which became apparent fairly quickly with the Henderson approach was that average weekly earnings takes no account of tax. It's a gross measure of income. It's income before you pay any tax to the government. And one of the problems was that taxes were beginning to go up rather sharply, partly driven by the inflation, which I mentioned earlier, but partly because the government was using the income tax system to raise the revenue it needed to fund its social programs. And this was happening to a great extent under the Whitlam government, which came to office in 72, I think, 72, 73. So what was happening, what would happen over, and what mattered to people, I should say, to people in terms of what determined the living standards, is their income after tax. is how much they've got in their pockets after the government has taken its share. So you couldn't really measure their poverty effectively using a before tax income measure, the average earnings, when what really mattered to people was an after tax measure, which we call disposable income. And that led to a big debate amongst the people doing research, and I was now on the scene and contributed to this, about how we might move from the Henderson average earnings measure to something that not only took account of tax, but the other thing about earnings, of course, is it's only one component of income. So people get their income from various sources, and earnings reflects labour income. But people also get income from capital in the form of interest and so on, particularly as they get older and accumulate assets and wealth, financial assets and wealth. So there was a lot of discussion going on about how we could broaden the Henderson measures to take account of tax and to take account of other forms of income. And the measure that came up with was a measure called household disposable income per capita. So disposable income is all sources of income. It's disposable. It takes account of tax. It takes account of growth in the population. So it's per capita, per head of population. It's a rather clumsy measure. And, if you ask the man or woman in the street, how's your household disposable income per capita going these days, they look at you as if you were mad. Whereas they would be able to tell you probably reasonably well what their earnings were. So the new measure was conceptually better in my view, but it did have problems, I think, with disseminating what it would mean in practice. What was happening internationally at this stage was interest in poverty research was beginning to take off quite dramatically. And that was in part driven by the fact that researchers were getting access to the data that you needed to estimate poverty, which is data basically collected in household surveys conducted by the Bureau of Statistics in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS. And so there was now an international movement towards trying to find a poverty rate that could be used in the same countries, could be used in different countries, but would be comparable across countries. And the measure that was developed was again a disposable income measure, but it was based on the median of the distribution of household disposable income. The median is the point that's halfway between the lowest income and the highest. So somebody at the median of the distribution has exactly half of the population with lower incomes than them, and the other half have incomes higher than them. And the poverty rate was set at 50% of the median household disposable income. And that's the measure that is now widely used to measure poverty in countries like Australia. It's used by ACOS and the UNSW team that we might get to talk about later. It's used by the OECD. It's used by the IMF, and it's probably, and it's referred to, I think correctly as now, as the international poverty line to measure poverty in higher income countries like Australia. It might need a different line in poorer countries, and there is a different line that the World Bank has developed, focusing on Australia. Half a median income was the measure that's now used, and I'm not sure how that relates to Henderson's original 56% of average earnings, but it wouldn't be that far away from that, is my guess. That we don't have any. Actually, we don't know what median income was back in the 1970s because the ABS hadn't started doing income surveys then, believe it or not. But so now we've researchers would use as a starting point, and they might supplement this with other studies, but as a starting point, they would set the poverty line as 50% of the median household income.
And what are your views on that measure? And I guess the other part of that is it's equivalized, like you said, it's per capita is one way of equivalizing household income, but the standard way, as you know better than I do, is to do something more sophisticated than that and account for also economies of scale within
Yeah.
households. But how do you feel about this as kind of the benchmark? It has been around for a long time now as kind of the benchmark poverty measurement, has the benefits of simplicity and comparability between countries. Do you think it's a good measure of poverty?
Yeah, I think it's okay. I mean, I did deliberately avoided talking about the equivalence issue in that discussion because it's rather complicated. But as you say, the basic point is that there's not actually one poverty line, although we talk about the poverty line. There's a different poverty line for each different kind of household. So a single person living by themselves, compare a single person living by themselves to a couple with two children, the Henderson family type. And clearly the family with two children need more income than the single person to achieve the same standard of living. And the equivalence scale is a way of trying to set those different family types on the same basis. So we adjust the income of the couple with two children downwards by applying an equivalence factor, which allows that to be compared with the single person. And economies of scale means that, of course, if you single person needs a house and a couple with two children don't need four houses, they only need one house. They might need a house with more rooms, but their house won't cost 4 times the cost of the single person's house. So there are what's called economies of scale that have to be taken into account. So aside from that, I mean, I think that the median income measure is fine as a starting point to think about poverty. It will give us a figure if we quote the figure, by the way, currently applying that measure in Australia is about 13%. The poverty rate is around 13% and is bubbled around that value now for 10 or years or so, 10 or 12 years actually. It's around 13, because about 1 in 8 people, households in Australia are below that poverty line. And I think as a starting point, that's fine. And one advantage of it is if you want to know, well, how are we doing compared to everyone else, you can go to the OECD website and you can get the poverty rates for 30 other OECD countries, all using the same measure. They all use 50% of median income in their own country. And if you do that, you find, a bit like when Henderson first started, that Australia is around the middle of the pack. We're nowhere near best in terms of poverty rates internationally. I mean, the lowest poverty rates are between 5, 6, 7, 8%, and the highest are in the 20s, over 20%. And we're 13%. We're almost bang on the middle of the pack. So it's a measure which is simple. People can understand what it means. We have the data to estimate poverty using that measure regularly and monitor how things are going. So my view would be, let's stick with that as a starting point. We might need other studies, and we can talk about those if you like, to if you like, validate what the income line, the poverty line, is telling us. But I think we've spent far too much time on debating poverty lines. That was the 90s. We wasted the 1980s and the 1990s arguing amongst ourselves about whether the poverty line should be this or the other. I think we now have a pretty broad consensus that the 50% measure is fine as a basic stage one, and we can think about how we might supplement that with different measures. That would be the way I'd think about it.
Thank you very much for that. So that sort of brings us to my next question, which was going to be about the poverty wars. So this is something that's very kind of strong in my own memory in my formative years as your research assistant at the Social Policy Research Centre. My impression, and I'll be very interested in your views on this, is that before that time, this is the early 2000s, before that time, poverty measurement, despite the fact that, as you say, was very it was hotly debated as to what the best way to do it was. It was still very much accepted socially and by the government as a really important and legitimate thing to do, is to try and measure poverty. Whereas the early 2000s were characterized by a pretty fierce debate between yourself and on one side, and then with Anne Harding as well from NATSM at the University of Canberra, against your namesake, the Peter Saunders at the Centre for Independent Studies, who, along with some of his colleagues, fiercely challenged the whole credibility of the whole endeavour of the of measuring poverty. I remember very clearly sitting around a little transistor radio with Social Policy Research Centre colleagues in the staff room, listening intently to the debate between the two Peter Saunderses, which I can't remember who hosted the debate, but it was a very big event, not just for us, but I think also for the history of poverty measurement in Australia. I wanted to just start off by asking you, about 20 years on from that debate, what are your reflections on that time and that debate specifically?
Well, I think it was a very important debate, and I'm glad now. I was glad at the time I got involved in it, although I hesitated, I must admit, because, as I was saying earlier, we'd already gone through quite a long debate about poverty lines, and suddenly we seem to be back in there again. And I mean, there were two issues. There were two issues at stake here. One was the issue of a conceptual issue, if you like, about what is poverty and what, if anything, should the government be doing about it. And the view of the people from the Centre for Independent Studies and other conservative think tanks was that basically poverty the way to reduce poverty was through economic growth. Economic growth would raise everybody's incomes. The trickle-down theory would ensure that even those at the bottom would benefit a bit. And to use a famous analogy, if you have a rising tide of growing incomes, it will lift all boats and everyone will be better off. And importantly, there's no need for the government to worry about doing anything specifically about poverty. The government's job is to maximize the income growth in the economy, and that will sort out the poverty problem as a byproduct, if you like. So that was the view that the centre and the Centre for Independent Studies and others were pushing, which was not just about measuring poverty. This was about the role of government and the importance of economic growth in determining not only the overall level of prosperity in the country, but also the well-being of those at the bottom, below the poverty line, if you like. So there was that issue, but and then there was the measurement issue, the nuts and bolts of the poverty line, and some of the things we've already been talking about, which the CIS the Centre for Independent Studies, were very adept at exploiting in a way that gave the impression that everyone disagreed about where the poverty line should be, and so the figures produced by these researchers were basically all rubbish and you could ignore them because you could get any figure you wanted by choosing a poverty line. And when I first came across this, when I saw on one of the commercial television news bulletins a debate between the other Peter Saunders and Anne Harding about, you'll remember the report that they produced, and NATSM had produced a report showing that during the 1990s, when Australia had experienced strong growth for the whole decade, the poverty rate went up. And this, of course, directly contradicted the CIS views, the trickle-down theory, that how could you possibly have a decade of growth and find that poverty had gone up? And one of the reasons that it's happened was that the poverty line that Anne Harding and her colleagues used was not linked to median income, but linked to average income or mean income. And the mean income is higher than the median in any distribution. And so the poverty line they were using was rather generous. And I must say I had a lot of sympathy with that view. I thought we'd all more or less agree that the median was the best way to go about things. And I found this report rather worrying. But when in the commercial news bulletin, my namesake, basically, who was a very competent media performer, ran rings around poor Anne Harding with the volley after volley of criticisms of the approach. And I think it left viewers with this view that, well, poverty researchers don't know what the hell they're talking about. So I went away, and I was rather devastated when I saw that, I must say. I went away and I was aware of what the Natsen report showed. And I read the report that the Centre for Independent Studies produced as their criticism. This was the basis of the debate on the TV that I'd been watching. And as I read it, I realised that the researchers at the group at the Centre for Independent Studies didn't understand how we researchers derived our poverty rates. And the reason they didn't understand was that they weren't actually researchers themselves. They had never estimated a poverty rate. So you'll never find a report on poverty from the Centre for Independent Studies where they produce a new poverty rate. All they'll do is criticise the poverty rates that other people produce. And they did that very effectively, but they didn't understand the complexities involved in producing those poverty rates in the first place. We talked earlier about equivalence scales briefly, and I said I deliberately not mention that because it's rather complicated. It's very hard for people to get their head around the idea of equivalence scales and how equivalent income is different to ordinary income. And the Centre for Independent Studies report also displayed that they didn't understand what the concept of equivalent income meant. And I wrote a short report to 4 pages, which the original report from NatSem had been published by the Smith family, who funded it and published it. I contacted the head of the Smith family and said, look, there are problems with the Centre for Independent Studies analysis, the criticisms of your report. I can summarise them in a few pages if you'd be willing to publish it. And he said, let me think about it, I'll get back to you. I think he was wary of getting back into another debate about where to set the poverty line. But anyway, I sent him the 4 pages, and they did publish it. It's, when I look back now at that little 4-page report, it is, I'm speaking modestly here, of course, it's probably the best description I've ever given of how to measure poverty and the kinds of pitfalls you can get into if you don't fully understand what you're doing. And I think, looking back, that was probably a turning point. I think that the Centre for Independent Studies suddenly realised that, in fact, it was more complicated than they had understood. And they thought, well, we might be on a loser if we push this line too much. And they haven't actually, ever since, this was now 20 years ago, produced reports which have been so technically, apparently technical criticism of poverty research estimates. And I think it's because of those criticisms I showed how they misunderstood how we did poverty research. So I think it was a very, very important debate in restoring the faith in poverty researchers. And now you won't see people criticising poverty researchers for making simplistic mistakes or doing this, that, or the other. And that's another reason why sticking with the median income approach has I think been quite valuable. It's got us outside, moved us beyond this question of should it be the mean, should it be the median, should it be something else, should it be 50% or 60%? It could go on forever about those debates. Point is, let's use a measure, let's agree that it's got certain advantages, we understand its limitations, but here's what the measure tells us, And if we use that measure, we can compare Australia today with Australia 20 years ago. We can compare Australia today with the US or Canada or Sweden or Germany or France. So there's tremendous advantages with sticking with the measure that everyone uses. And the CIS debate, I think, although governments, as I think you inferred, became rather wary of this argument going on in public about poverty research, I think in terms of the legitimacy and the acceptability of poverty research as an academic area of study, it was very important to put on the record what the strengths and limitations of the methods we were using were. And that's what we did basically.
That's all very interesting. The debate we had to have, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess your spin on it is probably more positive than I expected. My impression, and please do correct me if this is wrong, was that debate sort of caused the term poverty to kind of disappear out of the government lexicon, if you like, for maybe 20 years. I'm not sure if I'm following it as closely as you have, but you mentioned that the CIS exploited the kind of complexities of the measurement to try and muddy the water, if you like, for political purposes. So did they achieve that aim in terms of how the government reacted?
Well, I think yes is probably the short answer to that. They were very successful in that. And what I was saying earlier, I was talking as a researcher and about the integrity of poverty research as an area of study. Now let's look at the separate issue of what role does that research play in policy making, and how reliable do governments, ministers of social security, see those research results? And there, the Centre for Independent Studies did a very effective job. As you say, there are judgments made in setting any poverty line, and it's very easy to question the judgments, but there are judgments involved in all sorts of other measures. What's the definition of unemployment or employment? Working at least 1 or 2 hours a week. That's an arbitrary. Why 1 hour? Why 2 hours? We could criticize the unemployment rate. No one ever does, because we understand that you've got to set those thresholds somewhere. And we've all agreed that that's a reasonable threshold, so we'll stick with it. Same with the median income measure. I mean, what the CIS people did, though, and what they were far better than the researchers were at it, was capture the ear of the politicians and use the media to get their message across. And one big lesson from that whole episode, for me anyway, was, well, 2 lessons really. One was we need to be better at getting our message out there. And that, by the way, was something that Henderson was a master at. He was extremely good at getting his original results in the public domain, and we kind of lost that. But the other thing was that the way to address the frailties, if you like, of the measure in terms of the judgments that go into it is not to argue all the time about whether it should be this threshold or that threshold, but to produce different evidence, stronger evidence, to show that the people that we are identifying as being poor, i.e. with incomes below the poverty line, are indeed, to go right back to where we started at the beginning, are unable to achieve an acceptable standard of living. And that's what the deprivation approach to poverty has been doing. And that's why I would now always combine poverty rates that we've been talking about with evidence on deprivation to try and reinforce the view that there is real evidence that people with those low incomes are doing it tough, if you like.
Yeah, fantastic. Just on the kind of political space, I suppose, one thing that seems to have happened relatively recently, again, correct me if this is wrong, but in terms of what I've noticed is only quite recently has the word poverty come back to government documents. So it appeared in the recent Productivity Commission report, where they had a whole section about poverty and what the characteristics of people in poverty are, as well as a recent Senate inquiry. So is this just about the individuals who are serving in government now, or is there something more kind of I guess interesting going on in terms of how the political discourse has shifted again?
Hmm. Well, I think what you say is true, that the word poverty basically was, although this was never official policy, of course, was banned from government circles for a very long time. Following the CIS debate with the NatSem CIS debate, and so going back to the early 2000s, right through the following 2 decades, governments of both persuasions, you won't find them using the word poverty in any of their pronouncements, and that was it was a mixture of concern over the issues that had been raised in the poverty wars, but also I think probably a reluctance to raise community expectations about what the government felt it could do to address the problem without blowing the budget out of the water. And of course, budget constraint has been a big issue in Australia. It's a political issue. Both sides want to be seen as the best economic managers. That means something about running a budget surplus. And what we do know is if you want to make serious inroads into poverty, it's going to cost a lot of money. I think the other factor in all this was Bob Hawke's famous Ending Child Poverty pledge. So just so people know, in the run-up to the 1987 federal election, in the election speech, put in at the last minute, I am told, encouraged by his wife Hazel Hawke, Bob Hawke announced that if the government was re-elected, they would end child poverty in Australia, and they would do it by 1990. So this was in 1987. By 1990, no Australian child will be living in poverty. Now that is an amazing claim, and what we know since is that many countries, it was ahead of its time for probably the time ever in poverty. In the area of poverty, Australia was leading the game when Bob Hawke made that quote, and it was important for 2 reasons. First, it set a target. It was the first time really anyone had set a target for trying to get the poverty rate to to a particular level. And secondly, it recognised that child poverty was probably the most important element of poverty. That was the one that was going to have the most serious negative long-run effects. The problem was that Hawke gave himself 3 years to do it. And the one thing we know since then, it's easy to say this, of course, with hindsight, is that you can't reduce the poverty rate to anywhere near zero in 3 years. It's just impossible. The measures that you would have to take to do that would be completely unacceptable and unaffordable. It has to be done gradually and will take decades, not a few years. And I think, following that, I should say that many countries now do have targets for child poverty. New Zealand has a target. The UK for many years have one. Canada has one. US is nudging its way towards it, although it's not a big issue when they're not there yet. But they've all taken note of what happened in Australia and set a much longer time horizon to reduce it, or express the target in a more muted way so that it's clear that it's going to be a gradual reduction. And I think it was poor Bob Hawke's pledge that had more to do with why governments were not willing to use the word poverty than some of the things we've been talking about. But it's certainly true, as you say, that until very recently, the word wasn't used at all. And it's very encouraging to see that Productivity Commission report devoting a chapter to poverty, using, by the way, the Hilda data from the University of Melbourne, Hilda survey that's run, interestingly enough, from the same institute that Ronald Henderson headed back in the 1960s and 70s, the Melbourne Institute. However, and you might think, well, we've had a tough patch, but at last we're getting through it. But I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. And there are a couple of things I would mention that we give you a different view. One is that the government has now introduced a wellbeing framework and is looking to is in the process of establishing what's called a dashboard of indicators of well-being that cover all kinds of areas of life that affect people's well-being: health status, educational attainment, social interaction, political interaction, climate change, indigenous gaps, and so on. The dashboard is just a list of indicators in each of the areas that the government has set as priority areas that will be used to monitor improvement over time. And amazingly, astoundingly, in the words of the Australia Institute, which I agree with, or astonishingly it might have been, the poverty rate is not included in the dashboard of indicators that the government has published. There are measures of what's called making ends meet, people who can't afford to pay their household bills, or have got behind with repayments, or have had to seek external assistance to make ends meet. But none of them quite have the same quite impact as the poverty rate, and I find it unfathomable why the government has not included it in its dashboard. New Zealand, which is going down exactly the same track, they use slightly different terms there. They prefer living standards rather than well-being as the kind of underlying concept. But their dashboard of living standards indicators does include the child poverty rate, and I'm very disappointed it's not in the Australian list. That's one reason for dismay, if you like. You mentioned, I think, the Senate report on poverty, and this comes out of the Senate Social Affairs References Committee, I think it's called, something like that. And they have recently produced a report on poverty. And they've produced 2 or 3 reports before in the past, and the past ones have had absolutely no effect on policy. And I don't expect this one to have any effect either. It was delayed 5 or 6 times in production. So I think it was originally due to report in about 2020 or 21, and it only came out late last year, I think maybe early this year. I mean, it's got to, and like their earlier reports, there's some very useful information in there because they seek wide community input into people's views on the nature of poverty and what should be done about it. And so if you compare the reports over time, you get a good snapshot of what thinking is like at a particular point in time. And that recent report has some very, very helpful material in there about the nature of poverty and what needs to be done about it. But I don't think it's the kind of document that is going to have any effect, particularly when the government's dashboard doesn't include poverty as an indicator. So that's I'm not sure that's going to take us very far. The other worrying development, I think, in my view, is that I think I mentioned earlier that most poverty studies draw on information produced by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And Peter, you and I have spent more hours than we care to mention, you in particular probably, going through the ABS income surveys to help produce poverty rates. And those surveys used to be conducted every 5 years. And the ABS, under pressure from researchers like me and others, moved onto a 2-year cycle. So they would produce poverty rates every 2 years. But now the last one that was done was in 2019-20. So the one in 2021-22 was not done for various reasons. Although I'm told that there is one being in the field at the moment, I think in 2023-24, which will produce results that will be made available to researchers to analyze, probably at the end of next year at the earliest. So when you see, so the ACOS reports on poverty, which they produce in conjunction with the Social Policy Research Centre, using the 50% immediate income approach, you'll see a report saying poverty in Australia, 2023. That is poverty where in 2023, where the results were produced in 2023. The data that's in that is 2019, 2020. So we don't actually know what poverty is in Australia since 4 years ago. And that is very worrying development that the ABS are missed out on that income survey. I mean, they're having problems, I understand, with people responding. It's a very challenging survey to fill in because the degree of detail that's asked about income is very, very long, very difficult survey to fill, and more people are simply refusing to provide the information. I mean, income's always difficult information to collect anyway, because people are very sensitive about telling strangers what their incomes are. But the data is also a worrying issue. I mean, thankfully, we have the Hilda survey that can give us annual data, but my view was that for snapshot pictures of poverty in a particular year, the ABS surveys are better than Hilda for all kinds of reasons we don't need to go into here, but that the data issue is a worry. So, poverty, the Productivity Commission is to be congratulated on doing that. I think the ACOS SPRC work is very important in keeping governments honest, at least about thinking, informing the community what's happening. So all is not doom and gloom. I mean, I think we've made progress on the measures, and the ACOS work had some generous funding from a range of NGOs and from the University of New South Wales, and is flourishing still as an endeavour. So that's very good. But I think we still got a way to go to get a government that actually is prepared to say something like what Bob Hawke said in 1987, that we're going to address this issue, and this is how we're going to go about it.
I wanted to come back to the like you mentioned the dashboard, not mentioning poverty, and the contrast between that and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where goal number one in the SDGs is no poverty. So that's a very interesting contrast. The SDGs seem to have a lot of impact in all sorts of realms. They certainly do in the university environment, for one. Everything that we do, we're asked to see if we can link it to an SDG, and no poverty is a pretty good one to link to. So could you reflect a little bit on the relevance of the SDGs and the impact that this has had within Australia?
Yes, I think depends who you ask, I guess. I think, as you say, in the university sector, the SDGs and the agenda that's being driven by the SDGs has been very, very important. And poverty is given pride of place, goal number one, as you say, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And the second goal is to reduce by half the number of men, women, and children living in poverty in all its dimensions using national definitions by 2030. So this was announced in 2015, and the then Foreign Minister Julie Bishop went to United Nations and was one of several hundred signatories to the Social Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. But it's now 2024, so we've had 9 of there were 15. There was a 15-year time horizon, 2015 when we start to 2030 when they're supposed to achieve it. So we're 9 years into that. We've got 6 years left. And as I mentioned earlier, the poverty rate, as far as we can tell using the measures I've been talking about in Australia, has hardly shifted in that time. It's bobbed up and down at 1 percentage point above or 1 percentage point below 13%. And I did, when the goals were announced, I looked at how had we done in the last 15 years. But let's take the ABS surveys for 2000 and 2015 and see how we did over that 15 years. And the answer was, well, over that period, the poverty rate in Australia went up slightly, not by much, but it went up over that 15-year span. So we've had 9 of the 15 years of the current period and made no inroads at all. And this is going to come back, I think, to bite Australia in the international arena, because each country is required and is committed to producing a report on its progress against that measure I mentioned, which is reducing by half the numbers of men, women, and children in poverty, using national definitions. Well, we don't even have a national definition in Australia. We have a researcher definition, which is the one we've been talking about, but we don't have a national definition. A national definition means something that is endorsed by the government. That's what a national definition is, and we don't have that. I don't see us getting anywhere near that. So I'm not really sure how the Australian government is going to, front up to what by 2030 I expect to be a rather disappointing report on what's been going on in Australia. I'm not party to exactly what's going on within government about this, so I don't really know, but there are a few worrying signs. I mean, one of the problems was that because the commitment was made by the foreign minister at the original UN meeting, the department that was initially given the task of following up on the work for Australia was the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which I don't think has a very strong reputation for doing work on poverty. I mean, so the Department of Social Services is the department that we conventionally think of as looking at poverty work and poverty research in Australia, and they have over the years had some extremely competent people there working in that department. I don't know about them now, but they certainly have had good people and done extremely good work. And I think that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, may have given responsibility for at least part of the SDG goals, including the poverty one, to the Department of Social Services. But as far as I can see, there's nothing so far that's come out of the Department of Social Services about this. And the only report that's come out of DFAT was in 2019, which was a kind of stock take of what we knew and where we were at, a bit like the Senate report we mentioned earlier. So I'm hoping the work is going on behind the scenes to at least produce a report, but I'm not hopeful that we're going to get anywhere near achieving the goals. I can't see that in 6 years. I mean, we're almost back to Bob Hawke's 3-year pledge, right? And we've got a long way to go because we've made no progress so far. So I think that could be a very awkward time for the Australian government when they have to report on that.
Very interesting. Sounds like they need a bit of a shake-up or some public prominence given to the issues that you have just raised. On that note, I think let's leave it there. I had a couple of extra questions, but you basically covered them already quite comprehensively. So unless you have any final words, let's leave it there. And thank.
No, it's been very useful for me to talk through this actually, because it's been good to get someone like yourself to prompt you to reflect on what you've been doing. It's very easy as a researcher to get, as I'm sure you know, to get so bogged down in the minutiae of doing the work that you kind of lose sense of the bigger picture and where it's happening. But these driving forces like the data issue, the SDG agenda, the conceptual debates around what poverty actually is. These are ongoing and these are very important things. And I see the SDG agenda as kind of bringing them all together. And Australia is kind of heading towards a very thick brick wall that's not very far down the track. And I don't quite know what's going to happen when we hit it. We'll see, I guess.
And I do hope that this becomes a really useful resource for people to reflect on, not just in this class, but beyond. As you've outlined, you've been there basically every step of the way ever since the Henderson report came out in 75, was it?
Yeah, 75. Yeah.
All the way
My
through
first
to
week in
now.
Australia. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I'll hit stop recording now.
Okay.